Is this the downfall of OpenAI's ChatGPT, or is it a whole lot of nothing? If you've been following the news lately, you've probably seen the latest development out of China being DeepSeek, the new AI chatbot from a fairly obscure group of researchers and developers that really kind of took the world by storm.
Yeah, a pretty small company. I think it's something like their head count is 200 or so. Pretty small platform, and really came out of nowhere to really shock the AI market. I mean, we saw technology stocks dump pretty precipitously on this news. And what I want to do today is really dive into it and say, hey, does this matter for investors? Does it mean to offload your AI tech companies? Or is it a whole lot of nothing, like you said? I mean, that's the real question. So I want to get into that today. And so the first thing to mention is for those who maybe not familiar with DeepSeek, it's a large language model, very much like ChatGPT. And they released a model that had very solid capabilities. And what really makes the difference is that they said that they were able to train this model extremely cheaply. We'll get to that in a second. But essentially, a large language model is like ChatGPT. It filters through massive amounts of data, whether that's the internet, text, and is able to think and kind of process thought similarly to how a human can. So you can ask it a question, it'll provide you a unique response, something that is articulated in the way that a human possibly would. That really took the world by storm because it had these excellent capabilities and was supposedly trained at a fraction of the cost compared to things like ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, Meta's Llama. And I think the interesting part about it too is that it's an open source program, which means that researchers, individuals can look at the source code for DeepSeek and use it to run their own models, do their own research, develop new models using that original source code. Whereas most of the big large language models, OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google or Alphabet's Gemini, X's Grok, those are all closed source, so they do not reveal their code to the public. I thought it was really interesting, actually, OpenAI being called OpenAI, even though it isn't open source. The one exception of that is Meta's Llama is open source, but most of those big models that most users are kind of familiar with at this point are closed source, but DeepSeek kind of changed the game by releasing this very sophisticated open source model.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And like you mentioned, claims to have been developed for much less than what we're seeing those hyperscalers release their models at. The final training run of this, so not the whole model development. I've seen some, kind of confusing commentary around that. It was just the final training run of DeepSeek cost about $5.6 million, which is 45 times more efficient than all of those, than kind of your broad slate of hyperscalers are. So, $5.6 million, not free, doesn't, sounds kind of expensive to us. To these hyperscalers, that's nothing. That's, they're throwing billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars for the big guys at data centers and this whole problem. And so, to be able to do a final training run for $5.6 million is incredibly noteworthy and truly, differentiates the whole, that model from the whole sector. And this raises a lot of questions on, is it necessary to keep spending at the levels that Meta, Google, Microsoft have been spending at? And, what does that do for the whole market? Not just your NVIDIAs of the world producing these cards, but all of the downstream effects and all the downstream companies like we talked about on a podcast not too long ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's the real question, because you saw on the DeepSeek news, the whole value chain of the AI megatrend really got hit off of this. It went all the way from, like you said, NVIDIA's semiconductor chips and Broadcom semiconductor chips to the power systems that you'll operate within these data centers, to the electricity providers, to the energy suppliers. Even natural gas companies were getting hit on this, which was pretty wild just to see the breadth that was impacted from this DeepSeek news. It wasn't just tech necessarily. There's a lot of industrial companies that have electrification and electric grid components. And so that's where we have to say, hey, like you mentioned, does this change the game for data center investment? Because we've talked about before the amazing forecasts that some of these companies have for just how big data center build out's going to get, how much electricity is going to be needed, how many semiconductor chips. And so if you have a company that was able to do it cheaper, smaller on older hardware, then that does make a difference. Now we have to talk about how legitimate was this model. And the fact is, and what it really looks like, is that DeepSeek was primarily trained off of ChatGPT. And that became very apparent because a lot of people were, of course, looking into DeepSeek. How are they able to do this? What it looks like, and to use kind of a metaphor, if you're a student preparing for a test, there are kind of two traditional methods that you can go for, or a combination of both. You can either read the entire text or portion of the textbook in order to prepare for the test, or you can do a bunch of practice questions. You can just hammer out practice questions, and hopefully those practice questions are going to look what's on the final exam, but you may be missing some of the material in between. Or you can use a combination of those. That would be kind of a more traditional student's approach. Well, ChatGPT and a lot of the large language models, because they didn't have a rubric in place already, they didn't have those practice questions. So they had to read the entire text, train on immense amounts of data, very compute intensive, very costly. So they had to prepare using the entire textbook's worth of information. Whereas it looks like DeepSeek kind of took the shortcut, really just went practice questions and trained their model by querying ChatGPT. And the way that we know this is that on a side-by-side comparison that researchers did, DeepSeek was giving very, very similar answers to ChatGPT. Even over half the time they were querying DeepSeek, asking which model it was responding with a ChatGPT model reference. It was saying ChatGPT 3.5 or something like that, showing that clearly it had prepared responses off of those ChatGPT responses. And so it's really just using those ChatGPT, kind of responses, answers to user questions in order to train its model. So that would lend itself to being faster, cheaper, less intensive than having to train itself on the large amounts of data that these models traditionally have to use.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you're talking about asking all of the different models, something. Just post to any question, and they all provide you, maybe the same answer at the end of the day, but all worded differently, explained differently, different formatting with all of that. ChatGPT and DeepSeek were almost word for word in a lot of cases, like very, very similar answers. Looks and feels very much the same while everybody else is providing something unique. I thought it was interesting. You ask it about, maybe best cities to live in, it defaults to an American point of view, even regardless of, language that you're querying it in, country you're querying it in. So ChatGPT is going to default to that because it's American researchers. So it comes up with American cities. You ask DeepSeek that same thing, even if you ask it in German, it's still talking about St. Louis or, maybe even Austin. But so that's kind of, smells a little fishy there. And one other thing that I think is really, really kind of telling is that when it was launched, it had very poor Chinese censorship. And so everything coming out of China, has to, follow a certain standards. And for example, DeepSeek had been trained on, the Tiananmen Square massacre and, something that's erased from Chinese history books. So if it's trained on Chinese data, that wouldn't be in there at all. It wouldn't exist. So obviously it'd been trained on, some American IP, and it's really, really looking like that was ChatGPT.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. It's interesting to see that shortcut actually leading to what is at the end of the day, a fairly sophisticated model. It does provide good answers. But if you're talking about violating ChatGPT's terms of service by training your model off of it, they don't allow companies to do that. But of course, this is a Chinese company. They don't really have repercussions here in the United States because the legal system essentially can't touch them. Their application that was on the App Store has already been removed. It looks like access within the United States is going to be largely restricted, especially if OpenAI is able to confirm that, hey, DeepSeek really did train their model off of theirs, then it's going to become apparent, and US regulators won't let DeepSeek operate within the United States. But it does still bring up the question of, hey, if you can just train your model off of someone else's model, what's the point of all these companies with this big arms race in order to do this? Now, I think another important point about this DeepSeek situation is their claim that they were able to do it on inferior hardware, smaller number of GPUs. They claim that they're using NVIDIA's H800s, which are the old kind of legacy chips that used to be able to, and maybe in some circumstances still can be exported from the United States. But a lot of people are speculating that they have large quantities of the new H100 chips that do have that higher computing power. But of course, the company cannot claim that they have those because they wouldn't legally be able to get them via exports. And so they're likely sourcing them through third parties. Of course, we don't want to speculate too much on, what their physical infrastructure looks like, but many of the big CEOs, individuals who are big in the AI and data center space, don't believe that this model could have just been trained on legacy hardware. So that's kind of throws another wrench into this whole story of whether or not they were able to train the model on cheaper, inferior, less hardware than what these, OpenAI and other companies are using today.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like you said, don't want to speculate too much, but we can't, rule out the fact that is a possibility, because it does nothing to benefit them to acknowledge that, hey, we actually have, some black market chips here, and we have a way to route these into the country despite all of the US sanctions on them. So, they're never going to admit to having them, even if they do. So I think that's an important thing to consider as well. And then kind of moving on to, like you mentioned, performance. It is still a very performant model, whether, kind of in both legitimate and illegitimate ways. You have the legitimate ways of, it's very similar to ChatGPT 4.0, the latest iteration that uses kind of submodels to answer questions. So it has like one big model that can kind of just direct you to a submodel, where if you're asking a question about, chemistry, it's going to divert you to a chemistry specific, think of it like your own little PhD in chemistry guy, to answer those questions. So you're asking about salts, and it's not just assuming you mean table salt, sodium chloride. It's all chemistry salts are included in that answer. Right. So, it gives you more kind of in line with what you're wanting. So, and that's a big advantage to using those submodels. And that's a big, step forward for these models. So that's a legitimate way that it's scoring very well on these benchmarks. An illegitimate way is that it looks like it's being overtrained to look like it's performing well on the benchmarks. So essentially, if you take ChatGPT and you kind of know what the benchmarks are looking for, so you really overtrain it on that data, and then it'll perform very well on that data. But then once you start asking it variations, permutations of the same stuff, its performance falls off much quicker than ChatGPT's does. They're a lot more, jack of all trades over here. This is, very specific, hey, to the benchmarks, what the benchmarks are looking for. So we look really good there, but then usability does suffer from that. Like you said, it's still a good model overall, but there are signs that they're trying to kind of game the system a little bit to appear more advanced than they actually are.
Right. I think those benchmark tests really provided that shock factor initially, and that's why markets reacted so strongly to it, because that's what really leads us into this final piece of it. And that's, what are the implications? Does it have these serious implications that the market initially reacted to. And I think after you and I did plenty of research on this, a lot of other individuals across the market have been seriously looking into DeepSeek because of those potential implications that we mentioned. It looks like that the data center spend is going to continue very strong. The infrastructure is going to continue to be built. Semiconductor chips are still going to be in extremely high demand. And it doesn't look like so far that that's going to be very materially impacted, especially in the near term, from this kind of new thought about how to train AI models. Because at the end of the day, large language models are also just a piece of the pie when it comes to AI. I mean, you've got, especially for different uses, DeepSeek is not very good for things besides large language reasoning, where it's very text based. It doesn't have that kind of optical recognition the way that autonomous driving needs, or other kind of sophisticated robotic or other AI inferencing models need. So I think you're going to continue to have the AI data center build out. It's going to continue to benefit those companies, albeit we do have to look at it through a slightly different lens now, understanding that large language models may be a little bit more commoditized than we thought they were going to be previously.
Yeah, that's an interesting part about the open sourcing, about the commoditization of these models, is that if it really is just kind of a ripoff of ChatGPT, and to varying degrees. That's, I'm not calling it a total ripoff, but, depending on what it is, they could have essentially just open sourced OpenAI's model, which is very interesting. In, a lot of those perspectives. And it kind of leads us into the questions of how are countries going to protect their IP. Obviously, there's a lot of this activity in the US, and the US has a vested interest in keeping a lot of it in the US, or at least out of China. Additionally, protecting these American businesses that are spending, like I mentioned earlier, hundreds of billions of dollars on this. I mean, that doesn't do us any good if we're spending a ton of money and then the whole world gets to reap all of the rewards. And then on top of that, how are these individual companies protecting their IP? Like you mentioned, OpenAI, it's against their terms of service for another model to build it off of their model, but that's terms of service. That's not, doesn't really protect them. They don't get a lot of recourse when it's an international company, especially one based in China. Your terms of service only go so far. So is that, look like OpenAI open sourcing their model? Does it look like firmer controls around enterprise users and making sure no one's querying it too much, too fast, too broadly, maybe? Lots of questions that arise from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, like you just mentioned, there's really two paths that you can take. You can decide, hey, large language models, LLMs, they're going to be commoditized. Maybe we don't invest so heavily in creating the next iteration of the model because someone can copy it so readily, so easily. And so maybe we go the open source route where we let researchers access it, we let them develop it, kind of open it up to the broader academic space so that people can develop it on their own. It doesn't have to be guarded as a company trade secret necessarily. Or you can kind of take the other side of that coin and say, hey, I really want to profit off of this model. I think we can do it better than anybody else. So we're going to really restrict the usage, like you said, create more guarded, especially corporate and commercial usage of the models. Granted, yes, in the terms of service right now, but you're going to have to do things obviously beyond that in order to prevent, bad actors or unrestricted access to your model. So I think that's going to be the important factor that these companies are going to have to grapple with on a go forward basis. And then if you do take the open source route, I mean, I think these companies are still going to be developing the other areas of AI. You're going to switch more towards inferencing, less, for training. And I think that these models are just going to become a little bit more specialized as far as what their applications are. The LLMs will be that kind of, consumer facing model that everyone in their household is familiar with, while the implications for autonomous driving, the applications for robotics are very specialized when it comes to who's using those and how they're developed.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that open sourcing doesn't just mean giving away your product for free. I mean, there are still a lot of profit and revenue paths forward in open sourcing.
Right.
Taking a little bit different, but very poignant example is a lot of NVIDIA's software side is open sourced, and they've benefited tremendously because you've had years and years and even decades of people building on the software open source, and that's created very strong, robust software that environment that still has to be run on an NVIDIA GPU, which is similar but different to this. But it's allowed NVIDIA to be so successful because not only is their hardware the best, but also all of the software built on top of it is more optimized, it's more efficient. And so you can drive, like NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang always says, if the competitor chips were free, just the cost of operating them is still more expensive than just buying our chips. It gives you that, user experience and those efficiency gains. So I think, just using that as an example to show open sourcing, it doesn't mean all these companies are just going to eat their hundreds of billions of dollars in investment. But it's just going to look very different on that profit path.
Absolutely. And that makes complete sense. And I think it's going to be interesting to hear. We're in the middle of earnings season at the time of recording. And to your point, NVIDIA hasn't had their earnings yet, as we're talking about this. But it's going to be really interesting to hear what corporations say about their CapEx spend when it comes to AI, when it comes to chips, because we've already seen companies like Meta and Microsoft reconfirm, following this DeepSeek news, that they are going to continue their AI spend. They're developing, they're still going as fast as they can and getting as many chips, as many resources as they can to build out their AI models. So at least, I'd say at least for the next 12 months, it doesn't seem to be impacting the way that corporations are thinking about this. We'll see if that changes down the road. But so far, it doesn't really look like the broad macro backdrop has changed a lot.
Yeah. And coming off of this, to that point, is that NVIDIA has seen some, downward price pressure based on these concerns. Their backlog, their order book is still stacked in the time being. Like you mentioned, we were not going to see any deterioration in that for a while. And realistically, going forward, there's always going to be demand for more. If AI applications do continue, which I don't see a world in which they don't, there's still going to be driving demand for it. And I think that big order book for NVIDIA is going to allow them to pivot if they need to. I don't really think they will need to, but it gives them a lot more flexibility, which I think is an important thing to call out here.
Right. I think it's really going to be interesting to that point on the individual company basis. It's going to matter who you are, which part of the value chain you exist in, and how many other markets are you exposed to compared to, a very specific use case of AI. It's something that's going to continue developing. And frankly, I'm excited to keep researching and seeing where the industry goes.
Yeah, exactly. It's, even whether or not DeepSeek is entirely legitimate or not, there are going to be huge ramifications for the industry. So it's going to be exciting to watch.
Definitely. Well, Hunter, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Great. Thanks.